Welcome to Legal Resources Radio, where we invite you into the world of social justice, advocacy, and public interest law. Throughout this podcast series, we'll share stories, insights, and expert advice from our dedicated team at the Legal Resources Centre, as well as from our valued guests. In each episode, we'll dive into the legal landscape, tackle pressing social issues, and aim to empower you with the knowledge to make a difference. Whether you're a community activist, a legal professional, passionate about social justice, or just curious, this is the place for you. So wherever you are, washing dishes, at work, on the bus, train, or plane, or just relaxing at home, plug in your headphones, take a deep breath, and get ready to begin.
Welcome to the Legal Resources Radio. Today's episode is going to be a hot topic in contemporary political discourse. It would be hard to avoid words like public procurement, tender fraud, and corruption in any political discourse happening in South Africa at the current moment. Today we're joined by two guests, Sam Soul and Claire Rankin. Thank you so much for joining us. Sam, a veteran journalist, a proud street lawyer, a frustrated cop, and aspirationally, a scourge of crooked accountants, lawyers, and other thugs in suits. It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you, Sam.
It's very nice, and I hope I live up to the byline.
Claire, a colleague of mine, a candidate attorney at the Legal Resources Centre based out of our Makanda office, with a BA Law, an LLB, and an LLM from Stellenbosch University. Claire has also published in the Constitutional Court Review and the African Public Procurement Law Journal, to mention a few. Claire's interests lie in socioeconomic budgetary allocations and, of course, public procurement. I'm very grateful to work very closely with Claire. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Rashaad.
So public procurement, conventionally understood, is the system whereby the state procures or purchases goods and services from the public sector. When these checks and balances fail, accountability loopholes emerge and political or unlawful political interference emerges, what we then see is public procurement turning into a business opportunity to extract state funds for personal gain. So, Sam, I'd like to start with you as a veteran in the broader public accountability project, from his way back as the early 2000s, where you did a lot of investigative journalism work into the notorious arms deal. I'd like to start by getting your insights on the trajectory of public procurement and as you've seen it in South Africa's democratic dispensation.
Look, I think it's good that you start at the arms deal because that was in a sense our moment where we lost our innocence, not only in terms of procurement but in terms of oversight, accountability, the role of Parliament, the beginning of the destruction of some of our institutions. And it was also very, very important for understanding the pitfalls in public procurement, because what you saw very clearly there is that there's a formal process, which is the sort of box-ticking public process of decision making. And there is an informal parallel process whereby all sorts of other things go on in the corridors and behind the scenes, and where often the real decisions are happening. And it's partly because of the kind of heritage we have from 1994 of a kind of dual loyalty. There is it sowed the seeds, some of the seeds for where we are now. There's the loyalty to the state, but then there's also the loyalty to the party, and those two are often conflated in these processes. And beyond the loyalty to the party, we saw in the arms deal, but it's become a feature of procurement, where there are wider informal networks, political, criminal, patronage networks that feed off the state, that feed off these informal processes, and then try to present, in public, in forums like the Auditor General, audit reports, and all that, no, we've done everything properly, whereby we know that the whole system has been skewed to do things, other things that it's not intended to do. So I think, as going back from arms deal time, from the late 90s to the Zuma years, the state capture years, and so on, where we saw those sort of processes becoming institutionalized, embedded, where there was a program set in motion to capture certain institutions that made decisions about procurement, especially in the big parastatals, Eskom, Transnet, etc. And where we also saw the enormous damage that was done through that process. I mean, in the Gupta's case, it was in the billions that were extracted and exported, etc. But our view was that we haven't learned the lessons of that. Zondo went into procurement, the Zondo Commission went into procurement in quite some detail, reached some conclusions about the weaknesses and how to address them. And then when this process started, we saw that those concerns were being largely swept aside, and that's when we decided we needed to get involved in the process of trying to influence how the law was drafted and then challenge it later on.
Sure. So you've mentioned this sort of gradual shift to the institutionalization of these patronage networks. I want to bring Claire in on this. There's an understanding of the impact or corruption on one hand and its impact on human rights on the other hand. And I'd like you to maybe just expand on what are the consequences of weakened state accountability infrastructure? What are the consequences of this institutionalized patronage network that Sam speaks of?
So on a very real level, procurement is the bread and butter of service delivery in South Africa. And I think procurement, fraud, tender fraud, corruption, it's not something that's a unique South African problem, but it is something where the consequences are incredibly profound in South Africa, because we sit with a government that has, because of the wonderful constitution that we have and a strong entrenchment of socioeconomic rights, very strong service delivery obligations. Unlike other countries, unlike other governments, the South African government has very real obligations to, in a very concrete manner, provide citizens with access to housing, access to healthcare, access to a whole range of different social support services and the like. And that is primarily realized and done through public procurement. So when public procurement goes wrong, when money is used not to ensure value for money in procurement, not to ensure that we're maximizing expenditure towards social goods and services, but rather we're paying trumped up fees for sub-quality goods, what we really see is that the state falls behind on its service delivery obligations. And we see that everyday people suffer the most, ultimately. And I mean, there are numerous levels on which corruption in public procurement is so patently unlawful. It contravenes the procurement framework in general, but also it stands in strong contrast to almost all of the state's constitutional obligations to really try and maximize available resources for socioeconomic goods and services, to really try and ensure an effective and efficient use of state resources. And ultimately what you see is that unlawfulness in public procurement has a really real knock-on effect across a whole range of other obligations that the state has. I think sometimes it's very easy to get sideswept with the really big stories that we see happening and focusing on who's enriched through procurement fraud. And it's important to know that. It's important to recognize and hold those people to account. But we also need to keep carrying that line through to what happens as a result of that. Where do we see budgets get diminished in other departments, in other areas of government, and which services lose out effectively? What's the real opportunity cost because the state isn't spending its money properly?
Sure. I mean, you mentioned in instances where you have corruption, the state ends up paying overinflated prices for subpar services, in some instances for no services at all. And we have the Section 217 principles, fair, transparent, cost-effective, equitable. There's often a contestation between these principles. I'd like to bring the question sort of back to you, Sam, in terms of how do these principles weigh up in terms of the democratic vision? There's a view out there that, when the state, when corrupt decisions are made, it's an indictment not only on our constitution, but also on the promise of a democratic South Africa, because you have the most vulnerable people made to pay for these subpar services, in other instances, no services at all. How would you tie in those constitutional principles with the constitutional vision of a democracy?
Look, I think Claire has kind of set out our constitution is intended to be transformative. It's intended to ensure that decisions are made, that the state acts in a way that benefits the most vulnerable and protects the most vulnerable, etc. And I think all political systems are like this. But what you find is that special interest groups who already have power within the system tend to have the loudest voice, have more votes, and kind of override those imperatives, although they will be claiming to do so in the name of constitutional principles like transformation, etc. And I think this is always a difficult conversation, because the Constitution does require that we balance and weigh these different imperatives, and redress being one of those, and a perfectly justifiable one. But our sense is that any discussion of outcomes for the state has to look very carefully and critically, not at the stated claims and objects, but what are the real outcomes or predictable outcomes. What we want out of our decision-making process is an evidence-based policy-making process, and a debate that can be backed by different political principles, but that is based on an evidence-based discussion, because this is about the state's. The state is the biggest single spending point in the economy, and this is about how we spend this money and what it does or doesn't do for people. And it's an example that we all know now, but if we just take the Tembisa Hospital case, if we see the extraordinary percentage of the budget of that hospital that was extracted for the benefit of a handful of middlemen, and we can, like 2 billion rand or whatever over quite a short period was taken out of the spending on, and that obviously had direct impact on the people who were seeking, justifiable health assistance in that case, and a really, really significant impact. And the other interesting point about, and it goes to where we've tried to take some of this debate about the Tembisa Hospital case, is Jeff Wicks, the journalist from News 24 who really exposed that. He said the only reason they were able to expose the complete misuse of the tender system there was that they had access to Babita Diakoran's computer. They had total transparency over the spending and the procurement process. And that's why they could see that it was being completely abused. And in our view, if there are no silver bullets to corruption, but the most important, weapon in our arsenal, in terms of making sure that people are doing what they should be doing, is to have absolute maximum transparency. And we've had such resistance through this process from government, from Treasury, to adopting that principle, despite whatever they may say.
Yeah. Can I jump in on that quickly?
Please.
Because I think it's very easy for us to turn around and say that public procurement in South Africa is well guided, because we have the entrenchment of the procurement principles in Section 217, like you mentioned, and they do sound very good. I mean, transparency is supposedly listed there, right? But the problem that you sit with is there is no unpacking or defining of what any of those standards really mean. So we know we need to have a transparent procurement system. We know we need to have a fair procurement system. It needs to be equitable. It needs to be cost effective. But obviously, because those come from the Constitution, they're just left at a very broad principled level. And we've never seen the procurement system try to take those principles and really substantiate them to a point where you have a very clear standard of what they actually mean, what we can claim transparency in public procurement should look like. And transparency is an interesting one, because transparency doesn't just come from Section 217 in the Constitution. It's also supposed to be read alongside the right of access to information in the Constitution, which creates this expectation that any information held by the state should be disclosed. And if we think about it, all procurement information is held by the state. So if we're reading transparency with the protection of access to information, it's very clear transparency shouldn't be understood to just be when the state deems it convenient and necessary within the procurement process to allow a little bit of a look into certain parts. It's supposed to be comprehensive. It's supposed to encapsulate as well the kind of access to information that's enshrined elsewhere. We have this inability to look at how public procurement Section 217 intersects with other parts of the Constitution, the right of access to information, the principles governing the public administration under Section 195, which all make it very clear that there's supposed to be strong obligations of disclosure on the parts of the states, but also, like you're saying, Sam, this kind of evidence-based approach to decision-making. Everything in Section 195 requires the state to make sure that the decisions it takes in the public administration, and remember, public procurement is part of that, is really focused on ensuring effective service delivery and actual development in South Africa.
So I think the role, on one hand, as you mentioned, of investigative journalists and whistleblowers, and then the role of the law that you've spoken to, Claire, to ensure that there's some degree of accountability and some degree of transparency to, at the very least, safeguard our procurement system. I think we all agree the government spends, as research, the National Research Foundation has recently recorded, over R1 trillion on procurement. It caters for on average 12 to 15% of South Africa's GDP. So I don't think anyone can undermine the role of public procurement in developing South Africa as a nation and transforming South Africa as a society. I do want to introduce a specific question, and I'd like to get both your thoughts on this view. So conventionally, when we hear words like corruption, tender fraud, we understand it to be moral and legal failures. But there's also a context in which these moral and legal failures emerge. South Africa, under the apartheid system, made it impossible for the emergence of a black middle class. There's an interesting article by Professor Van Holt. It was published under SWAP, and it asks about the reframing of what we conventionally understand as corruption to be a form of class formation. Now, we've discussed various principles. Equitability is one of them, but I'll take it that far. I'd like to hear your views on that point.
Yes, so I know the paper you refer to, and I have great respect for Professor Van Holt, but I do think he is to some extent engaging in a bit of intellectual game playing without really having a sense of the real consequences on the ground. Because I think everything that we've seen, for instance, in the Madlanga Commission, etc., suggests that this is not a kind of lumpen class formation process. it is an extractive process. It's a kind of neo-colonialism, if you want to try and coin a phrase like that. It's a we're developing a parasitic bourgeoisie, and I think other scholars have warned about the dangers of that, especially in post-colonial states.
It's interesting that you mentioned the neoliberalist version, because I mean they in those type of circles and in those intellectual spaces, it's discussed as an alternative accumulation model that goes against the globalized neoliberal system. But Claire, I'd like to get your thoughts.
Sure, I think it's exactly what you just said there. It's an accumulation model. And I think that's the key problem with how we've seen it manifest in South Africa, because obviously post-apartheid, we needed to address economic imbalance in South Africa.
Sure.
But the most blatant economic imbalance, I don't think lies between different levels of middle class. It lies between those living in poverty and entirely reliant on government for services, and those who have the ability to, at some degree, sustain themselves. And I think really, if we're looking at procurement as the mechanism through which we create a new middle class, that might be effective at doing it. I think you can dispute the degree to which it is, because again, it's a very, very small group of middle class we see coming from the procurement process, because it is really biased towards strong networks of patronage there. It's really not a very widespread benefit.
Sure.
But realistically, the biggest transformative issue has to be getting those who are in poverty out of poverty, and trying to enrich people through their ability to participate in the procurement process. Will never do that, because the person who relies on government for access to healthcare, the person who relies on government to be able to put a roof over their head, how are they supposed to participate in a tender process? How are they supposed to start a business that allows them to benefit from that as a method of transformation in society? I just think the most pressing transformative issue has more to do with effective service delivery, because that's really where you'd see the more substantial impact in South Africa.
And in fact, I think that argument provides a fig leaf for the other larger extractive players to justify their own, their own accumulation. Historically privileged businesses and groups and so on, white business, rich white individuals, etc. Yeah. So if we're going to have a competitive extractive economy, I don't think those on the bottom are going to really benefit from anything.
I think sometimes maybe a focus on tailoring redress and procurement to focus on, local content, local industry, but localized to a very particular geographial region where you're looking at a particular project being undertaken. Something like that might tend towards being more effective. We see it a lot. This isn't something ever done through the formal procurement process, but anecdotally, when schools are given money to fund their own school nutrition program, for example, they're able to draw from businesses in the local community, and they're able to try and ensure that the economic growth goes in that direction at a way that really ensures value for money for the school and maximizes what they're able to get. If we can try and encapsulate the essence of that, then maybe the redress through procurement might more effectively try and change it. Yeah.
Well, Claire, Sam, I wanted to thank you. I think those were all important insights, and these are obviously discussions that are not going anywhere. If anything, will become only more relevant as things progress. We are on the cusp of, hopefully the cusp of the enforcement of the Public Procurement Act, subject to various challenges, and I'm sure we all await to see what happens on that front. But thank you to our audience and listeners of the Legal Resources Radio.